Good morning, neighbors. Spectrum. We're going to talk about spectrum instead of something else. So that word spectrum has a lot of meanings. If you speak to a mental health professional, they might go to spectrums of autism, if that word's still viable. They might go to spectrums of PTSD. They might go to spectrums of obsessive compulsive disorders. Now, a spectrum usually has a middle or a peak. If you want to view a spectrum, it can look like a bell curve, right, with an area underneath it. So that spectrum, the middle of the bell, is usually considered zero, the average, the mean, the normal for the population. To the right and left of that is a deviation from the population. So this spectrum can be used, this word has a lot of applications. I went through a doctor, a medical professional, if you use that word, what he might think, consider, or wander off into in his mind. But you framed your conversation. You've given them the idea of a bell curve, a range of options, a deviation from the normal, a statistical sample size worthy of considering the conversation, and all the details that go into the validity of the data. So what ends up happening when you do this, when you do these samples, the sample size matters, the target audience matters. But in this spectrum, in the idea of a spectrum, you have the center, and then you have the range around it. This is where zero comes into your mind now. Because zero might be the middle of that bell curve. That's the average, that's the norm. To the left of the zero is negative numbers, to the right of the zero is positives, and that describes the spectrum. Negative 10 is blue people, and plus 10 is yellow people. And whoever's in between is between plus and minus 10. Now there isn't a beginning or an end to this range. There's nuances way out at the edges of this curve. The curve doesn't go on to infinity. At some point you lose, there's no more people to count. You can't, there's just nothing else to put out there. So this sample has a specific size, whatever that is. We're going to sample people of color from one end of the color spectrum to the other. So spectrum, I lost that word for a minute. It's back. So this spectrum has a zero in the center, a plus and minus number, but it has no beginning or end. Or it does have a beginning or end if you measure every single thing in your sample size. So this didn't make it easy, but this is trying to give you the idea of floating ranges. These things that hang around in the atmosphere, these little clouds that come and go. But that's a range of temperature and humidity. So these spectrums, let's get into measurement spectrums. Let's talk about sound, what the human ear can hear, consciously and subconsciously, just in hearing. Hearing, to a human specifically, is the feel of vibrations from an atmosphere, right? The vibrations from the atmosphere. So the only medium that can carry this is either a liquid or a solid. Atmosphere is liquid. Earth is a solid for conversation points. So you've only got an odd spectrum. You've defined a sample size inside some other bigger thing. It's now a spectrum. It has a relationship, but it might not have a beginning or an end. It has a zero. It might go up to 100 and stop, or to minus 100 and stop. It doesn't continue forever. So it's a limited spectrum. It has bounds. These bounds, if you're doing math and statistics, are well defined and understood how to get to those bounds. And then you go to a peer review to make sure that others agree with your bounds decisions. Now, none of this includes supernatural perspective, so keep that in mind. It's not in the conversation magic. So we're discussing, I'm talking to myself about a spectrum, where spectrums are. You can see a spectrum in my video sets. The sample size is somewhere at 400 or 500 videos now, 3 a day. 2 or 3 a day, with a few breaks. So, in that random sample size, the folks that listen to these videos don't spend much time here. And honestly, I don't blame them. What's the point, right? So in my spectrum of viewers, which is about 10 people right now, only a few listen. Only a few will get this far and appreciate that just an old fart in an easy chair at this point. But I like to think these are how things work. This spectrum word, spectrum concept, spectrum idea, spectrum application, that word, huge word. It's freaking bigger than 3-letter words. What's it, 8 letters? Had to use my fingers. 8-letter word. Spectrum, 2 syllables. So simple and basic, yet when you get specific, to me it gets interesting. Which spectrums are you in? And we're going to take this back to politics now. You look at the spectrum, the sample of supporters of the douchebag in the office, the people enabling this level of politics. This is not a majority. This sample size is very small. It's less than 20% of our nation that feels the way the media wants to present it. How many people think if you want to bring your firearms off of your property, you better have $1 million indemnity insurance to walk off with that weapon? Have all you want in your armory, with license, with permit. Is it that hard? Is growing up really that hard? Religion is the face of this virus. Think about it. Make us look stupid.